So last time it was more about we had a topic we were thinking about, and then it was a chat for a while. But this time we came prepared. We did homework. We have
Yep.
topics. I don't know how many we're going to cover, but we have a couple of topics. Lee, what was the first one you want to talk about?
Um, let's make let's talk about the making learning fun.
All right.
We'll go into that first. Do you want to dive into that first?
No, go. What do you mean by making learning fun?
So I think we kind of talked about like we can talk about it from like an instructor's point of view, but also just like as individuals going out paddling, what are we doing to develop ourselves and to make it fun to develop ourselves? Get better at skills and to do things that are fun. And both of us had kind of mentioned games that we've played, even just with our friends, um, to create like a fun learning environment or something that you can just play around with that you end up developing your skills with.
I think it's fun when people don't realize they're either learning a new skill or practicing new skill because they were either tricked by friends or instructors into doing something fun.
Hey, I teach kids for a living, and my job is to make them not realize they're learning. I see
That's true.
it.
As soon as you tell them, as soon as you tell them they're learning something, like, I'm done with this, I'm out.
Yeah.
So I
um,
remember the first thing that stands out for me was when we got into the pool that one time and you made everybody do the race. Oh, no, no, no. We were on the Shubi that one time and you made everybody warm up with paddling only on one side. Remember, what
oh
was that one like?
yeah, yeah. That's Blade Runner. I got that from Chris Ladner from Eco Marine in Vancouver. He had a games workshop that he did, and that was one of the skills that you'd have to work on, where you can't take your blade out of the water. You just have to like keep it on one side and just kind of work the paddle on that one side and make it so that you can take a stroke. It's really fun. Really like forces you to really feel your blade in the water and understand where it needs to be to move around and where it needs to be to catch.
And it also helps with linking all those strokes because it's hard to, like, a lot of times we think, okay, if I want to maneuver very quickly we go into using a reverse stroke to counter whatever we're doing rather than trying to finesse what we're doing.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, I do this all the time. Like sometimes, like, you know how when you pull out into current, you need to always have positive strokes. You're not supposed to take away your speed. But our first thing, if you're not lined up just perfect, is to plant that blade in there and try to correct our angle,
Yes.
right? And I think an exercise like that is exactly the kind of thing that helps us think of, or like last time we were talking about muscle memory, is being used to, well, I don't have to stop my motion in order to correct what I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, I even another activity that's sort of like that that I really like is Jeanette Gallen calls it Kayak Ballet, where you're trying to follow the shoreline in and out with your boat. And you can swing your bow or swing your stern or whatever stroke you need to do, bow rudder, stern rudder to make the boat kind of swing deep into these little crevices along the shoreline. And the smoother you can do it, the better. And she always saw Gary Dorn as really good at that kayak ballet. A little shout out for Jeanette.
I
Still
think
love that.
the other thing too is it doesn't matter. Well, I mean, it matters a little bit because of maneuverability, but you can play with these exercises in any boat, really. Like some
Absolutely.
obviously will be more maneuverable than others, but like sometimes when I get my mom in one of our wreck kayaks in the summer, we usually go to a cabin, and whenever I get her in there, I don't tell her that I'm giving her tips on how to do something. I try to trick her into it because otherwise it won't go well. But yeah, a lot of these things, like it's not like you need a special type of kayak to do a lot of these fun exercises. You could just work
No,
on your strokes and just your maneuverability, regardless of what kayak you have.
it's fun to get in different kayaks and try them out and even like figure out like a lot of the boats that are built for touring that have big long keel lines. When you get them on edge, they're quite maneuverable. So you spend some time working on the edges in that boat and then start to get the edges, you can really start to feel some nice playful turns around each of those corners. Like my mind always goes to the Nord Cap and how good it feels when you're playing with it properly and it's up on its edges and feeling good coming around all those little corners and nooks and crannies. I love doing it at the lake as well, not just in the ocean, but it's often a thing that I'll do on a day when the ocean's blown out or I don't feel like going into the saltwater chuck. It's nice and warm. You can just keep your shorts on and just go to the lake and play around with it and push your limits a bit.
That also makes me think of edging. That sometimes is great to put into a game too, because sometimes paddlers can be scared of edging because they think, oh, I don't want to over edge or whatever. But if you could slip it into an exercise or into just fooling around, that helps a lot too.
I think people don't work on their edges enough. Like I take people through a little progression where I kind of work on edges and find that like 1, 2, 3, 4 spot like on your edges where you can really um, find out how the boat moves in those 4 different spots. You could break it down into 10 if you were really, really good. But you can probably break it down to 3, even like you're kind of neutral, 1, 2, 3, and feel how the boat turns. And if you spend some time on someone else's bow, just feeling out those edges and kind of leaning towards their boat a little bit and like getting used to being on that part of the boat, it makes a big difference. And understanding the difference between an edge and a lean also helps.
Do you want to go through it very quickly?
Yeah, so an edge, you're using your hips to move the boat. Your head's staying completely over the boat, aligned with the center of the boat. When you're leaning, you're actually using your head and your upper body to lean the boat, and you're using your inside knee to hold the boat up. So your inside knee is pushing up to balance that boat out underneath you. And then you can kind of bobble on that corner a little bit. It's a bit, you're in a bit more of a vulnerable position, but I use leans for like whirlpools and spots where the texture of the water is different. Like even in some like downwinders and stuff like that, I'll use a lean coming down a wave and kind of lean into my turn a little bit. When I'm surfing, I use it. I'll lean right into a turn. But it's not as effective when you're just using it to turn the boat and you need a leg drive and stuff like that, or some legs to turn the boat. It's more effective to have an edge, I would say. What do you think?
Uh, it's interesting. I've gotten different information from different coaches, and it's interesting to hear everybody's take on it. But what I like is I like when people just give you different information and they say try it out for yourself and see what works for you. Like I used to be very much of the mind of my knees controlled all of my edging. But what I found is I was always very tense because of it. And then I've had other instructors tell me, try controlling your edging more with your butt. And while I'm not as successful, it's another interesting take on it where, like, for example, if you wanna edge, let's say you want to lift up, I want to lift up my left knee, but instead of thinking about my left knee, I'm looking towards that side. I'm dropping that butt cheek, the opposite butt cheek down, which would be the same as pulling the left knee up. And by doing that, I'm not locking myself into the knee positions. I haven't been able to turn that into muscle memory yet. I still use my knees because that's what I learned with. And, we always talk about you always default to the first things you learn and what you feel more comfortable in. But I like Nigel Dennis one time said in one of our classes that if you took a kayak and you just threw it in really rough water, it would stay upright. We're the reason it capsizes, right? So the idea is keeping your hips and your waist as loose as possible because the kayak itself wants to stay upright. We're the ones that tense up and bring it down. So if I'm thinking about my edging, usually I'm using my knees. That's the first thing that comes to mind. That's where I'm more, I'd say, more capable. But it seems like using my butt has been more efficient in keeping my hips loose and letting the kayak do what the water wants a little more. But then linking all of that back to last week's conversation, the pool sessions are fantastic for this because you overdo it and you go under, no big deal. But it's really a good place to practice that. Even though a lot of times when we get in a pool, we just think roll, 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 or working on rescue, 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 or wet exit. But sometimes working on these other things is also really
like
helpful.
working on sculling. Just working on sculling for a little bit. That's always nice to do.
I think so.
Helps with the edges as well.
When you just asked, what do I find easier with my edging, etc., I think the hardest part of answering that question is the conditions I'm usually in. Like, let's say if I'm trying to get on a wave or ride a wave, they're so short and I have so little time to think that half the time I don't even notice what I'm doing because I'm focusing more on do I have my blade on the outside edge or on the inside edge, or oh crap, is it gonna just pound me now? And the few times I've been in conditions where you have a longer time to play on the wave or whatever, that's when I started to play a little bit more with edging. I remember one time we had a very long conversation with a group of people, and it was all about edging. I think it lasted about 8 hours. And I remember you were saying something about that you like to feel it as if you were doing a cross check as you switch from one to the other when you're on a wave.
Yeah, it's more about paddle placement. A lot of people, I think, when they're surfing, especially, they've been trained to do a bow rudder way back behind their seat.
I fall into doing that all the time because that's usually
it's not as much leverage as when you're like way up in that powerful position up in front of you and kind of getting that blade on the water, and you're able to feather it and kind of use it to turn the boat.
That's right.
And Costain Leonard was the one who taught me that originally. Like, we were at Skook, and I was kind of like fighting my boat a little bit. I was in the sisu, I think. And he was like, get that paddle out in front of you. It'll be a better pivot point for the boat.
Well, what I find I do all the time is when I do that and I find that I'm just fighting the kayak, I'm just not lifting that front hand up enough. I don't mean elbow, I just mean hand, so that to bring that paddle closer to that pivot point rather than all the way in the back.
Yeah, and I think like this is a more powerful position than down here where you don't have as much range of motion.
Right. Okay, so
making learning fun.
Making learning fun.
So back to the edges. In the pool, you mentioned the pool, and I will spend a little bit of time in the pool when I'm on. I do a bunch of work, just like holding on the edge of the pool, working on edges. And it does make a big difference, especially if you do it in a few different boats and kind of start feeling how the different boats work. And like, I play with where I'm sitting in the boat too. I'll move myself up a little bit. I'll move myself back in my seat a little bit. I'll try like sitting on one side a little bit. Like I'm tucked in there pretty good and fitted in my kayak pretty good, but I'll still kind of like sit on one sit bone and see what it feels like, just to get like that feeling of all those different spots where I could be in the boat. And just balance on them and feel what it is like to balance on just like that spot if I can. If that makes sense. And it does make a big difference with my confidence in the boat. Like, and with my balance in the boat, because my body just knows like, okay, that's my boundary there. That's where I can be. That's where I can't go further than.
I remember the first time when my wife and I got wreck kayaks, when we started paddling. My dad has this tiny above ground pool. I think it's like, I don't know, 15 feet or something. And one of the first things I did is I brought the kayaks over to his tiny pool and then just started tipping it over and over just to see where that, because the very first time you get into a kayak, any kayak, it just feels so crazy tippy. But
Yeah.
then once you go over a couple of times, you feel more confident of, oh, okay, I now know what it feels like, that last moment,
Yeah. Yeah.
the point of no return. And because it was in his little pool, next time I was out on the water, I mean, we were in a small lake, whatever, with the kayaks, I just felt a lot better because I knew how far I could push it. And so I felt a lot more comfortable.
Nice. What are some fun things that you've done to work on edging?
Fun things for edging. Figure S's or figure eights have always been good. Follow the leader
Yeah,
has
that's
been
a fun
good.
one.
Let me think. What else?
What about stuff you can do with your friends if you're just like out on a friendly paddle? I love to do the like, hey, let's just try to paddle on edge for a distance, then switch to another edge. So you paddle for on an edge for a distance. And I find I'll start out like here, but as I go longer, I'll be able to bring my edge up a bit higher, which is nice. And switch to the other side and try to paddle. Trying to maintain an edge. I find lots of people can edge like for a short time, maybe through a quick little turn. But being able to maintain an edge is a separate skill from that. I feel like
Well, I
it's a little
think
bit more practice.
right, and I think that that's also for each person to see how they can do it because I've been finding that if I just lock one leg or pull up or whatever, I'm not as effective holding it for a longer period than, like you said, changing my weight from hip bone to hip bone or turning and looking in one direction or the other, which it's funny. It reminds me of, how in a motorcycle, you don't turn, you look where you want to go and your body kind of follows. And for kayaking,
Well,
it could be a similar thing.
Sid Sidfield, there was the four um, things that he taught us at Bay Fundy: speed, edge, angle, look where you want to go. Those are the four. And it's spelled seal, SEAL. Easy to remember. So, like, I've used that when I've been coaching people quite a bit because for current, that works. Obviously, they use it for whitewater. And it also works really well for surfing. Like, you have to figure out your speed so that you catch the wave, but you don't overdo it and end up where you don't want to be. You have to worry about your angle, where you're pointing your boat. So you almost want to be perpendicular to that wave. And then uh, your edge. So whether you're going to be edging to go one way or the other, kind of that first carved turn, you're looking for it almost right away, and then looking where you want to go. That little acronym works really well for those things. It's in line with what you were talking about.
So another fun thing to do, I remember one of the first times I went out with a group in Connecticut. They're called Cognac. This older gentleman in this beautiful, beautiful wooden boat that he made himself. We were talking about edging, and I was just starting, so I didn't really know a lot. And he said, "Yeah, check this out." And he just kept paddling straight the entire time, and just by going from edge to edge, he was doing these beautiful turns, nice and slow, but he was paddling straight. His strokes did not change, but his hips were moving, and therefore he was able to turn and shift and move his boat around in S's and almost circles, all by just movement of the hips. And it was
That's
really cool
awesome.
to see.
Yeah, and like I've seen people even when they're surfing, like holding the paddle out and then just like trying to use, without actually touching the blade, trying to use their body or the elasticity of their body. When I talk about it, I think like your kayak's on a frictionless surface. So if I twist this top up here and the bottom's on a frictionless surface, what's going to happen? It's going to follow. So that whole idea of like just twisting your body, you're like putting pressure on the boat to turn when you do that.
Right.
And I've seen people out practicing like that, like in their surf kayaks, just trying to track your boat with your body rather than force it with the paddle. It looks pretty awesome when you can do it.
Lots of in the seat, lots of practice.
Absolutely. Yeah, that would be on the higher end of things to try.
Well, but it's something to work towards.
Yeah, for sure. And even if you're thinking about it, like, if you're looking where you want to turn, you might as well twist your body too, because it's going to follow. And that's for anybody, beginners and up. Even on flat water, you can try it out, like take a few strokes and then twist your body and see how long it takes your boat to kind of come around. My camera just quit.
All right, so picking a face spot. Go.
Yeah, I watched a video today with Paul Kuthi in it. And he was talking about how he'll go to an area and ask the water taxis and stuff where they don't want to go. And that's where he wants to go.
That's where he wants to go. Let's make that very clear. That's not where all of us want to go.
He also had a part in that video where he was getting sucked down the whirlpool, and almost his whole kayak was in that whirlpool. Like, it was pretty impressive.
Yeah. He has many videos for which I would just sit on the beach and eat some popcorn and watch. That's about it. So, okay, no, but that's a very good point about, like, I always like to say, talking to locals is the way to really get into a new spot. Like, I think because there's just so much we don't know, especially if you're just getting started.
I feel so bad for some people who come to Jordan River for the first time, because there's like a bunch of like cultural things, I'll call them, rules that have been imposed by the people that are there. And it's kind of a set of rules that the little community that's there sort of follows to keep everyone organized and safe and feeling good about what's going on, and also to avoid confrontations.
But I was talking more about confrontations of the nature kind, more than of the people.
Yeah, fair enough. But it's a result of the confrontations of the nature sometimes that you end up with these other issues, but figuring out kind of what's going on in the environment so that you understand what you're coming up against. Another spot close to us is Race Rocks, and it'll run like up to 6 knots through there sometimes. And when there's wind against it, it is nasty and big.
Well, I think just the name itself is not very inviting unless you like, I'd rather go to, something like Calm Beach, and then it turns out there's something bad. Okay, but that's the other thing, is especially in the beginning when we're just getting started and we don't know how to read water just yet, or we don't know what to expect. Or there's a story I like telling of when I was out in Mendocino with Kate and Jeff. Conditions were not too crazy, but compared to the East Coast, the West Coast is significantly bigger. And there was one spot that from afar, it seemed like a perfect play spot. It looked like there was a really nice, fun line that you'd be able to run between a couple of rocks, and it was a steady thing. And so before we went anywhere, of course, we were just, part of what we were doing was assessing every spot to see if we could run it. And so the reason we were looking at that one in particular is, at that point, Jeff said, okay, just let's sit here and see what happens. And then a couple of minutes later, all of a sudden, the water in the entire spot just drained, and this massive thing just came and annihilated the place. And but it was crazy because the rest of the time it looked okay. You could follow it. But every couple of minutes, there was swell coming from a different direction. Jeff knew how to keep an eye out on it. He knew that place did that every so often with swell that came from a specific direction. And if you didn't know better, or if you could sit there for a couple of minutes and think, okay, this is perfect. But if you weren't there long enough to see that one cycle that came through, that would have been just getting bashed against these big rocks. And from my perspective, since it was my first time learning to read those kinds of situations, I was blown away because I was simply learning to see, okay, can we run this? Can we not? Does this look okay? But I wasn't expecting it to all of a sudden this amount of time to be just ridiculously scary. And then another thing that happened on that same, I think it was a different day, the very first time we went out in this one spot. So we make our way out, and all of a sudden, I think conditions were, I don't know, between 11, maybe 13 feet swell. I can't remember. And this one spot that we came out, just this wave was forming that was enormous. From where I was sitting, I was holding a camera and I looked up and my eyes were like just saucers. I was like, are you taking us here? So I don't remember if it was Jeff or Kate that came over and they were like, Luke, don't worry. That's just this one rock formation, or I think it was a coral reef or something. We're going to go right by it. And if you were just a couple of feet over to the side, it was super deep, absolutely peaceful, completely fine to paddle just around it. But from where I was sitting, the very first time I saw it, I thought, what are we doing? But they knew exactly how to, okay, single line, we're going to go through here, we're going to go through there. And it was fantastic. But it was just knowing exactly all those things. And then not only knowing the places, but having been there many times and knowing what happens in certain situations with swell from these directions and what happens when they add up, or when, like you said, that one place, the first thing you said is it can get up to 6 knots. And then if the wind goes in the opposite direction, it gets nasty. That right there says you have local knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a pretty common thing where we live, is that wind over current scenario where it's like wind going against the current and making those short, steep waves. We get it a lot at pinch points too, like at headlands and stuff like that. We'll end up with a lot of rough water. So if you're paddling like through a bay, at each headland, at each end of that bay, you're probably going to get some more action than you would in the middle of the calm bay part. I was thinking of a time that we were kind of looking for some trouble.
As we often do.
Yeah. And we'd headed out to the spot we had planned to go in, and we took a look, and it was big, like really, really big. And a couple of us probably could have handled it, but there was a couple of us that definitely couldn't have. And we made a decision to go to a spot where it was quite a bit smaller that day. And I think that that's one thing that's worth saying is, like, cater to your group. Like, don't push your group out of the ability that they have. To a point, obviously, you want to get people outside of their box a little bit and uncomfortable once in a while. But if you take them too far, they won't like paddling anymore.
That's right. They'll go. You learn while you're pushing boundaries a little bit, but once you go into survival mode, it's just not fun anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and like the fear takes over, and your fear of awareness shrinks, and all of a sudden, I've actually been in a situation where people have left a group because their fear of awareness has shrunk, and they've just been paddling off on their own line. And even with whistles and trying to get them, they weren't coming back. Somebody actually had to physically go with them, get them to rejoin the group because they just lost their severe awareness. The conditions were just too big for them.
And another thing on top of that is I've found that sometimes if I've taken classes, let's say surf class, sometimes I'll get more out of a surf class if I play in small waves, because if being in an environment that's a little more forgiving or that you're extra confident in, then you can apply new information so much easier than if you go into something that requires a lot more of your skill. Then you're focused on just performing well. You're not adding to the mix, right? So even if you feel confident being in whatever, a certain size or a certain type of chop or a certain amount of wind, sometimes if you want to learn something new, you don't need to push it so far out. Like, try adding that into something where you're comfortable so that you could really excel at trying something new.
Yeah. I was in one situation too where we were out and the wind picked up while we were out there. We were playing at one of our local play spots, and it was fine when we went out, but the wind just kept picking up, and it probably got up to like 30 knots. It was kind of blowing us away from shore too, like on an angle away from shore, not perpendicular to the shore. And it became like we were all survival mode. Like we were just keeping up and being able to attain in the wind and stuff like that. And eventually one person was like, okay, we're all, if somebody needs to be rescued right now, I don't know if anyone can actually go and rescue them. They're just going to get blown right out. Like we need to call it. And we all just called it and kind of went in, and it was good that we did that because our energy levels were just going down because we were fighting this wind the whole time. And, you know, if nobody brings it to anyone's attention, then everyone just kind of keeps going and having a blast. And like, if the gas tank's empty though,
Yeah.
could end up in trouble.
But that's the other thing too, is if we haven't practiced a rescue, let's say in a month, and we try it in a pool session or we try it when conditions are good and we're rusty, it's not the best idea to try it for the first time in a long time in one of those situations.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that's part of it too, is just because you, like, I remember I did a video once where I was out in Long Island and we were out playing. I think it was, the gusts were between 20 and 30. And I remember I was just practicing some rolls, and I discovered for the first time rolling where you're coming up against the wind is so much harder. Or it was at the point that when I was upside down, the wind was picking my kayak out of the water in that direction of the wind. And so it wasn't letting me capsize all the way. So then I realized, okay, I should just roll with the direction of the wind to come back up. And that to me was a revelation. I hadn't witnessed that before. I hadn't felt that before. And it was really cool to experience that and then to share it with people. But that's why a lot of times it's great to practice things in really calm or smaller conditions, because when you throw something like that into the mix, it's better to have all your stuff like on lockdown so that you're not trying things for the first time there, or like trying to sort things out or sort out how to empty a boat when you're in very high winds. And we can easily say that weather changes all the time without asking us. Do you know those books, Deep Trouble? Have you read any of them?
Yeah. I've got one actually in my bag right now with me on this trip that I'm on.
Yeah, so I have them too, and most of them start with, "It was a beautiful day. The weather was supposed to be great," and then it just goes into some ridiculous scenario. But it's always the same thing. It's like, The weather was supposed to be great, yet a tsunami came by later in the day. Every time I'm out and weather gets bad, and if people say they're surprised, it always makes me think like, why are you surprised? The weather does this all the time. We think it's going to be perfect.
Plays into that like red light, green light, yellow light scenario of like how to assess risk, right? Like, have you used that model before?
No, what's that?
The red light's a no-go. The yellow light's like, well, we could go, like it could be okay. And green light's like, yeah, for sure, everything's good. A yellow light might be like um, a forecast of a change in weather further in the day. Or a yellow light might be at the top end of the conditions that you would normally paddle in or be comfortable paddling in. So you're kind of like proceeding cautiously, and maybe instead of doing a crossing on a yellow light, maybe you decide to just follow a shoreline instead of going out to that island to see that island. So it's just a great tool to just be like, okay, as a group, what's our red light, our yellow light, and what's our green light? Like how? And then you can apply that tool, and it just kind of gives everybody in the group some common language to speak how they feel too. Like they can explain how they feel by like measuring with that light. Like for me, this is a yellow light, or for me, nope, this is a red light. So then the whole group can get a sense of like, are people saying yes, no, or maybe to this? Kind of a good way to chat about things.
I think that goes really well hand in hand with what we were saying before about catering to your group, whether it's just fun with friends or a class or anything. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, you know what, I don't know, I played soccer all day yesterday, I'm a little sore, so today I need to take it a little easier.
I've done that before where I've had like a tough day the day before. And then the next day I've just said, hey guys, I'm not going to cross the Eddie line much. I'm going to watch.
Yep.
I'm going to pay attention, and I'm here to backstop and rescue people. But I don't want to be too tired to like not be able to participate and not be able to help if we get into a bad situation.
I agree. That's usually when I take out my camera all the time. It's always a nice excuse for me to say, oh, you know what? I'm not feeling it right now. All right, I'll just stand on the shore and film.
Yeah, perfect. And actually, like listening to that, I'm not feeling it. Now, I tend to push through it sometimes. Like, I feel like if you've had a bad wipeout or something like that, it's good to push yourself to get back in the saddle and to like try things again. But there's also like a time where your gut, you just need to listen to it and just be like, okay with not doing what you plan to do. Because your gut's telling you it's not a good idea right now.
True. But it's also really good to gauge if, if you just got wiped out, are you actually hurt? Because sometimes it's hard to tell right then. Like, adrenaline's pumping, you just had a really nice ride, or we just did this crossing or whatever, but you might have tweaked a shoulder a bit more than you think. And then after you rest on the beach for a while, or after, maybe the paddle home will be a lot tougher. Mm-hmm. So it's also good to keep an eye out on that stuff too. Like that's happened to me before, where let's say I was working on rolling the day before in the pool session, and then the next day we're out on the water and my shoulder's just not feeling it. Then I need to pull that back and just not look to injure it more or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that that's a good like risk assessment thing too. Like, am I physically able to do this right now?
And if
too much, have I had enough of a break between my last paddle and this paddle, and the right kind of a break?
And similarly to that, making sure others in your group know that. If there's any limitations or anything they should watch for, making sure your group knows. Not because it makes you less of a paddler, but it's always good to have people on the lookout so that if something happens, they might be quicker to come assist. Because, like, let's say you tweaked your shoulder or a wrist, and then you capsize. If you told someone else that you tweaked something, they will keep more of an eye on you. And then if something does happen, they'll come and help rather than, oh, Lee usually gets his roll. He'll be fine. I'll just go for another wave or something. It's good for others to know ahead of time too.
I've done that before where I've looked at someone and been like, oh, they're good. They've hit all their rolls today. They're doing awesome. Then I look away for 2 seconds and I look back and they're swimming. And you're like, oh, they're getting tired. Usually that's the case, is like they're just getting worn out from a long day. That's when you start making mistakes.
That's right. It happens to all of us. I remember when I was at Blue Hill with Jared and Chris that I took a swim on the last day. It was 3 days of paddling. Towards the end, I was exhausted. And we were just playing in a bit of swirly stuff, just going in and out of current. And I remember I caught an edge and I went over. And as I went over, I made the decision, which looking back on it, it feels really dumb, but I just made the decision, I'm just too tired. I'm not going to be able to roll up. And I pulled and I swam and Jared came and got me. And there's nothing wrong with swimming, but looking back on it, I probably used so much more effort getting back in the boat and swimming than if I just slow things down. And not only that, I was in a dry suit, and probably all the buoyancy from the dry suit would have kept me up just fine. And it wasn't that much current either. But because I was tired, because I was a little bit chilly, and it was the end of 3 days of playing, my mind just shut it down and said, just pull, get out. And it's funny when that happens.
You want to see a video of me hanging on last Friday? Nick and I were there, and on the way there, we were talking about how we were all in between swims. We had like that whole discussion.
Yeah.
So I'm cutting across this wave, and I'm cutting to the right, and I can see it closing, and I'm like, nope, I'm gonna get out of this. And my boat's coming up, and then all of a sudden my bow just like goes down, and you can see in the video my bow just goes down. Nick actually has the video from his perspective, but it's pretty far away, so you can't see it that well. But my bow goes down. I start riding the buck and bronco, but I get under the bottom of the wave and I get flipped. And when I get flipped, you can just see my paddle blade kind of coming over. And then I think when I went over, I kind of went over the falls, like upside down. So it felt like I got sucked right out of my kayak. And I assume that's when I hit the bottom of like back onto the water again. And I'm almost completely out. Like my knees are at my thigh braces. And I'm like pulling myself in as much as I can. But quickly, I kind of hustled it and tried to roll up. Like just tried to muscle it up, basically. And I'm like, oh, that didn't work. The second time, I think I pulled myself in better, but maybe a wave hit me. And then the third time, finally, you can see my paddle, me holding my paddle and pulling myself like into the cockpit and making sure that I'm locked right in. And then I roll up.
Do you think the beatdown came from being tired, or it was just good conditions and the wave won?
Oh, I think the wave won on both of them. Like the one with Nick, I was trying, like this is me playing. And actually I was going to use this as an example of me having fun. Like this is what I'm doing. The wave was breaking like perfectly from like 1 point down, kind of rolling down, big V. So I was trying to ride across the top of the break before it closed out and get to the other side. So I was like having a game for myself to shoot down and across and make that turn to come back down the wave on the other side. I might have some footage of me getting down on the other side and getting across it too, but it's pretty steep. So if you make a mistake, you get caught inside. Then the other time, so that was the first time I was playing that little game of chicken with myself and I lost. And then the second time I was with Ben Morrow, one of my friends, and I'm watching Ben and I'm like, oh, Ben's getting trashed. I'm like watching, and he's just getting pummeled. And then I look and I'm like, oh, I'm caught. I thought I was outside, but I was inside. and I was caught on the inside, and then I just get banged twice, like because the wave behind it got me too, and I get kind of back surfed a little bit.
Okay, so I think a good tip to walk away with the whole talking to locals or whatever is a lot of times if you reach out to paddling clubs, that's usually a very good resource in terms of local knowledge too.
Yes, yeah, we have a few around our area, and they have a lot of people. There's a lot of like dedicated people that are part of them that know a lot of things. Usually in those networks, you can find out pretty much anything about the area that you want.
Yep. Likewise. And then you could also find out about gear. I think that it's also helpful. Like, for example, someone will tell you, well, this specific spot, yes, these are the conditions that you'll see when the weather does this, this, and that. And if you want to play there, then I recommend you're in this kind of boat, for example. Or this particular spot, always make sure you go with at least 3 people. Having local knowledge is one thing. The other thing too is if you're doing that, let's say something bad happens, and then you're also dealing with, let's say, a current you weren't expecting, that makes it so much worse. Let's say one of your friends gets hurt or you have to tow someone back, and you don't know that at like whatever, an hour after the tide turns here, the current really gets ripping in this one spot, and you're trying to bring someone back to safety, and that's what you're dealing with. That just compounds like a bad situation into something so much worse.
When we teach it in some of our courses, we use a thing called the lemon theory, and there's a couple different ways to teach the lemon theory, but the way I like is like thinking of like juggling a lemon. Anyone can juggle 1 lemon. 2 lemons? Sure. Most people, they could probably throw them from hand to hand. 2 lemons. And think of a lemon as like somebody forgot a PFD. A hatch cover's not working quite right. All of these are lemons. All of a sudden you add conditions into there. You're juggling 3. Some people can juggle 3. Some people can't. Some people can juggle 4. But now it's just like, the 5th one is definitely going to cause everything to fall onto the ground. And we talk about like, you're always trying to set down the lemons. So like if you get a lemon, figure out how to get it out of your hand. So fix that hatch cover properly. Just go get the PFD. Like try to coach the person through the tow so that they don't like maybe work on their stroke a little bit beforehand or whatever it is to avoid that situation happening. Be proactive.
Or make sure your skeg actually deploys before you go into wind.
Yeah, well, one of my mentors.
Mine was just completely stuck when we were doing a wind lesson. We had to stop and pull it out.
Oh, that happens.
Yeah, it happens.
One of my other mentors that I did my level 3 with, Mike Gilbert, he's big on like, I don't want you to worry as much as like fixing problems. I want you to teach people how to avoid the problems. Like the avoidance is the cure, not learning all these different ways of dealing with all this stuff that you shouldn't have got yourself into in the first place. Like staying out of those terrible situations is more important.
I like it. I like thinking of it as trying to avoid screw it moments. Like, you know, when you have 5 people, everyone's ready to go, and you're like, crap, my radio's dead. Screw it. Let's just do it. All of my bad situations or bad decisions, I can always trace back to a screw it moment where I just thought, it's all right. Let's just go anyway, or let's just do this anyway. And it's the same thing. It's not that I needed to fix it, but avoid that chain reaction of what could happen.
Yeah.
Because afterwards you can come right back to that. Yeah, exactly. All right. So I think that's a good note to end. It's funny. I think we had like 3 other topics we wanted to cover, but we'll just have it for next one. Okay. So Lee, next time we'll talk about, we have a couple of more topics for the next one. We're going to talk about some books, some films, and paddlers we admire.
Hi, everybody.
All right, see you next one.